Welcome everybody to Inside Asian Gaming's Trade Talk. My name is Ben Blaschke, Managing Editor of Inside Asian Gaming. Very pleased to join today as we talk about everything that's been happening with Star Entertainment Group by Peter Cohen, former Executive Commissioner and CEO of the Victorian Commission for Gambling Regulation, and of course David Green, former presiding member of the Independent Gambling Authority in South Australia and a key consultant to the Macau government ahead of liberalisation in the early 2000s. Of course, both men have been heavily involved in consulting to the industry worldwide for many, many years. How are you, gentlemen?
Very well, thanks, Ben.
Look, so plenty to talk about today with Star Entertainment Group. And I mean, first of all, look back to what's been happening with the company for some time now. Of course, it was late last year that the man brought in to try and save the company, really Steve McCann, announced that the company was in some financial trouble. Late last year, they acquired a $100 million loan facility with the option for a second, pending fulfilling certain conditions. Of course, Steve McCann provided an update earlier this year, confirming that Star was burning through the money that they did have at a pretty fast rate and casting some doubt on the company's ability to continue into the foreseeable future. Now, Peter, you and I spoke, I think, more than a year ago about what might happen if Star was to become insolvent sometime, although I think we were being quite speculative at that time about a worst case scenario. Today, that scenario seems far more plausible and possibly imminent at this stage. How would you assess the current situation for Star?
It's clear from the public statements that they're making that they're forewarning of the possibility. That's an obvious thing to say. And I don't think we've seen that before in Australia with any of our casinos. So we are very much in uncharted territory, and there are a number of various ways this could head. Star has the, I don't know if it's an advantage, but they have the situation of being regulated in 2 states, 3 casino operations in 2 jurisdictions. In both jurisdictions, there is a different view about what the governments want from those operators. So even though Star has properties in both places, it's going to be dealing with governments that have different attitudes to what they expect to receive. But I think it's important to start with pointing out that governments and regulators don't actually care where the shareholders of these businesses make money. They care that they stay afloat and that the players get their money back, that the tax gets paid, and there's sufficient money to invest in the property to keep them going, because they're generally on government-owned land, and as a landlord, they want that property to be maintained in good order. But the last person that the government cares about making money is the shareholder. And what the governments can see is that they have a legislative scheme in place to allow for the possibility of failure. We never ever thought it was ever going to be used, but all these pieces of legislation, which go back the early 1990s for New South Wales and the 1980s for Queensland, have a mechanism to allow for failure. So that mechanism may get called into play, but it's a reality that governments and regulators actually don't care where the shareholders make money. And that's pretty clear in New South Wales at the moment. The New South Wales Premier quite clearly has done a political calculation and worked out for him that saving Star is not that important, not politically. And Steve McCann has to face that and his board have to face the fact that the government and the regulator probably don't care if they fail, as long as the business continues, which we might talk about a little later.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, David, I mean, similar as Peter just said, he hasn't seen anything quite like this scenario in Australia before. I assume the same for you then as well.
Yes, indeed. I think it's interesting to actually look at some of the legal framework around it, because as Peter says, there is provision for failure, but it's not entirely clear what happens if, for example, the Star was to try and sell out while it's viable. In other words, before any event of bankruptcy should occur. There's certainly provision for mortgagee sales. There's provision for withdrawal from the casino agreement in Queensland. But it's not clear to me what actually happens if they sell viable. Sorry, I'm just struggling a bit here.
I guess the question too, Peter, assuming Star does become insolvent, we probably shouldn't assume, but let's say they do in the coming months. What is the process then for the respective state governments? How do they approach that situation?
Well, New South Wales has had a practice run at this already by suspending the licence of Star for the Star property in Sydney. The legislation allows the government to appoint a manager, and that we always assumed that piece of legislation was there for the purpose of a company going insolvent or bankrupt, not because they failed a probity test, which made them unsuitable to hold their licence. But nevertheless, the mechanism is fundamentally the same, that the government appoints a manager. And the assumption has always been that the government would then go through a relicensing process, and they could do that through an expression of interest or whatever mechanism they want. But that would be what you'd expect would happen here. So if Star was no longer able to trade, the government would, in normal circumstances, appoint a manager. In fact, they've already done that in New South Wales anyway for Star. And that manager would run the casino until the government runs a process to issue that license or a new license to a new provider. That mechanism, you'd expect the New South Wales government behind the scenes probably have already war gamed these scenarios to work out the best way to do it, whether it's an expression of interest or whether it's just put it up in the marketplace. I don't know, but they should know what they're going to do. It shouldn't come as a surprise to them that they might have to act. And I would expect in the current circumstance in New South Wales, they would extend the management agreement that they already have with a manager appointed because of Star's unsuitability on a probity basis. Whenever that happened, that's been a while now, but I think I imagine they'll just continue to extend the manager's arrangement.
I guess a key question would be: is there any scenario under which either the Star Sydney or either of the two, one or both of the two Queensland casinos could actually close? Is that the scenario that could actually happen, or would governments do whatever they could to avoid that situation?
I can't see any of them closing. The manager provisions that are in the legislation precisely to allow a casino to continue. That's why they're there. Governments do like the jobs that these casinos provide, and we know that the casinos are really big employers of individuals, both directly but also through contractors and ancillary services and everything else that surrounds a casino. It's most unlikely that the casinos would actually physically close. I'd be certain to say that the Brisbane and Gold Coast ones won't close. Sydney is a slightly different scenario because there's another property on the other side of Darling Harbour called Crown Sydney. So even if the casino in Sydney was to close, the Star Casino was to close, there is an alternative available for the government to sort of kick into play as a replacement casino. So it is possible that the Star Sydney could close because it resolves a different problem for the New South Wales government, and that is they could use that to help Crown Sydney to become a more viable operation. But on balance, I would think it's more likely that the Star property in Sydney, Star Sydney, would continue trade, but under a management of a manager appointed by the government. But I think it's most unlikely that Sydney would close, and almost impossible to believe that either of the Gold Coast or Brisbane would close. There's no need for them to close.
Yeah, look, there's a whole heap of scenarios that we're going to run through shortly of how things might play out, who might come in as a white knight potentially, and how that might play out. But David, I'm interested in, Star is in a unique position in that it does operate in two states with two separate regulators governing them. How does that complicate the situation should Star essentially run out of cash?
Well, I think it complicates the situation in the sense that, as Peter alluded to earlier, politically, there are different perspectives and different filters that are going to be applied to the responses that might be adopted in either jurisdiction. New South Wales does have the benefit of a potential redundancy, and that is Crown Sydney, even though at the moment it trades under a limited license. It's certainly not inconceivable that it could be given a full license effectively to replace Star were that required. I don't see that scenario transpiring, I might say. I think it's a fairly unusual and unlikely scenario, particularly given that it would be attractive in a fire sale, especially to any number of prospective suitors. I think Queensland's a little different because the license for Queen's Wharf has a 25-year exclusivity, and you would need to take full advantage of that, I think, geographical exclusivity during that period. The entire license, I think, runs for 99 years. So there's plenty of back end available to somebody to buy into that. What is different between the two, I think, is the way in which they've analysed and looked at the whole question of suitability to operate. We've had the regulator inquiries in New South Wales really come to quite different conclusions about suitability to what Queensland has managed to come to at this point. And I'm not sure whether that reflects a difference in regulatory approach or a difference in desired political outcome. That's an open question to me.
Yeah, I mean, question to either of you, but on that point, David, does Queensland have more to lose in a way, given the size of the Queen's Wharf development, the importance to the city, and I guess even Star Gold Coast, the importance to that area as well of that particular development?
Well, I think yes and no. It's probably not strategically as important to Queensland as Star is in Sydney to New South Wales, because they've got a rather different distribution of casinos. It's not as big a market anyway, domestically, as New South Wales. So I'm not sure that they're really in a totally different or inferior position to New South Wales in Queensland. But what I think will develop is an awareness that the associates of Star, in particular Chow Fook, bring other things to the table. They bring brands to the table, the Rosewood brand, for example, as a hotel brand, the jewellery, and so on. So when you look at the integration of the resort and the fact that Queen's Wharf has really been developed that way, it's a somewhat different proposition to the Star in Sydney, which was built essentially as a casino with a few add-ons. That hasn't been the case with Queen's Wharf. So in a broader context than just the casino, yes, it is important to Queensland. And that's why I think, in part at least, it may explain the difference in view about suitability of the associates of Star in Queensland.
Peter, do you see a single group, like be it a Blackstone or a global operator, coming in and acquiring all of Star, or do you see it being more of an asset breakup, assuming we get to that point?
If I'm an outsider coming in, I think I'd prefer the asset breakup because I don't really want the residual problems that Star Entertainment Group are going to have if I can avoid that. And what Blackstone found is when they bought Crown, they also inherited all the historical problems, which resulted in $250 worth of fines from the Victorian regulator, which I suspect they weren't anticipating. They knew that the AUSTRAC fine was going to happen, and that was clear in the process because they talked about that as being a potential trigger to get out of the sale process if it was over a certain dollar value. As it turned out, that didn't get resolved until after the sale went through, but they were at least cognizant of the possibility. I think the fines imposed by the Victorian regulator were probably unexpected by Blackstone. So if you buy Star Entertainment Group, you're buying all the residual problems that are still there, and the experience that Blackstone should forewarn someone that the issues are not yet fully resolved, and you may end up, as the owner of that company, getting more problems than you thought you might have had. So an asset sale might be more attractive to a potential buyer. On the other hand, if you're a reasonably big operator and you want to get a footprint in Australia, casinos in Brisbane, Gold Coast and Sydney is not a bad starting point. But you've got to go in with your eyes open, knowing full well that you might have a number of unanticipated costs that flow through. Now, I don't know who those operators might be, but historically, although perhaps not in the last couple of years, Australian casino licenses seem to have some premium attached to them in the terms of status. It would help if you had a license in Victoria or New South Wales, Queensland, or any of the Australian states. It would be seen as showing that you have been through a process of assessment that matches it with other high value jurisdictions such as Singapore, Nevada, or New Jersey. Whether the Australian brand is a bit more tarnished now, it's a bit hard to tell. Well, it is more tarnished now, let's say that, but whether that tarnishment can be removed by a bit of silver polish is a little bit difficult to know, but I think it probably will be really relatively quickly. And an Australian license or a state-based license in Australia could be quite valuable. So, I could see why someone might want to buy Star, but I could also see that buying one of the assets might be a better business decision.
Well, mentioning Blackstone, I mean, they've been mentioned in various media reports as potentially a likely suitor for Star in whatever form that may take. David, does a Blackstone acquisition make sense, or do you think they've got their hands full with Crown?
Well, I think at the moment they've got their hands full with Crown. They may have returned to suitability, but certainly not profitability. And if you look at an entity such as Blackstone, profit's what makes the world go round. It's not complying with regulatory requirements or preserving a means of generating income. It's actually the outputs from that are going to be the measure of success. So I think there are obvious synergies. If Blackstone were to be able to acquire Star property particularly New South Wales, that would make a lot of sense and give them an opportunity, I think, to apply the lessons they've learned in Victoria, particularly with their governance and their internal controls and their knowledge of the regulatory environment, which they seem to have been slow to pick up the lessons of at Star in Sydney. It would make some sense, but there is also an issue of whether the trade practices legislation would allow that in terms of does it compromise competitiveness? Does it result in undue concentration of power, in particular in a foreign company? And I can't opine on that. I don't know the answer, but it is an obvious issue which would need to be taken into account.
Do you see any issues there too, Peter?
Oh, no, I agree with David, particularly as the New South Wales government's argument for allowing Crown Sydney in the first place was to provide competition in the marketplace. Now, that may well have been just a political statement to help get the legislation through the New South Wales Parliament to provide the best possible case to allow that restricted gaming licence, which is what Crown Sydney's got, that legislative scheme to get through. The competition argument is important, and I suspect the competition argument will also be informed by the fact that there are also still 90 or 95,000 poker machines elsewhere in the state of New South Wales, and there are also electronic table games in clubs in New South Wales as well. So I think there's a reasonable argument for those wishing to say competition is not too diminished to say that there is competition already out there that won't be diminished. But I think we can see from previous cases that the argument about competition is not necessarily as simple as it just looks on the face of it. I think there are other complicating factors that the ACCC would be looking at in terms of competition. I think it's worth adding, of course, also, I expect our audience knows, but of course, Crown Sydney does not have poker machines at all at the moment. So it is a different business model, not just two competing casinos.
One thing that I really haven't seen spoken about anywhere really is Steve McCann came out, as I mentioned earlier, last year and this year, talking about the fact that Star is it's cash flow negative at the moment, and basically saying he sees no immediate solution to that problem. So it's a loss-making company at the moment. We're assuming that if Star was to go broke and declare bankruptcy, and we're assuming that someone would come in eventually and potentially buy out the company. But is there a situation where any potential suitor would look at Star and say, why would I want to be involved in a loss-making company? Is there a situation where governments in New South Wales and Queensland have nobody throwing their hand in the ring? And what happens then?
It's a good question, because would a new operator necessarily be running the company at the same profit position? In other words, would they be in a better position to make more money because they don't have the overhang of themselves being a problematic company? Would a government be more predisposed to some relief to a new operator rather than Star, which is cause of problems? I think a government would be. I think there is the possibility of a government being more helpful to a new operator than Star, because the politics at the moment of helping Star is not good. So it just doesn't look good for a company, for a government to be helping a company that's thumbed its nose at regulatory processes. So a new operator, whoever that might be, might actually get a better situation, or in a better position with the government. And there are things the government can do to help. They can put delays on things like stamp duty and tax. Well, they can change the tax rate for gaming. The government doesn't want to, but they could if they wanted to. They could put some provisions in that provide a bit of timeline. So for delayed payments of tax, there are various things that they can do. On a more extreme level, and Star would be most angry if this was to happen for somebody else rather than them, but they could give them more poker machines, which they've always asked for, to enable them to get more revenue. So there are things the government could do in New South Wales to help Star, which they might be prepared to do for a new operator rather than the incumbent who has, well, behaved so badly. Perhaps they just don't deserve that help.
Yeah, David, what are your thoughts around it? I mean, one of the arguments from both Star and Crown at the moment, aside from increased compliance costs, is that they're facing tighter regulations and requirements around, even members signing up and responsible gambling play, cashless play, mandated carded play, that pubs and clubs in the same areas do not face. And so players they walk into the casino and say, this is too hard, I'm just going next door, I don't have to do any of that. Is that something that governments or regulators would pay a lot of attention to? I mean, would they really care that that's a problem facing Star and Crown at the moment?
Well, I think the evidence to date is they probably don't care. It's a calculus that involves looking at what the political direction of the government is, and I guess where votes are or are not, as the case may be. It also depends on the concerned sector, what sort of feedback is coming from there, what sort of criticism is being attracted. We know that casinos in Australia are always under a societal microscope, and governments of both persuasions are fairly reluctant to challenge that, at least overtly, by taking decisions that are going to be broadly unpopular. But I think we need to look a little further afield than just Australia. I mean, when we're talking about Crown, Melbourne, Crown Sydney, the Star Sydney, we're talking about globally facing properties. These are not designed to make money purely out of local market. They're really looking further afield. And if we look at the dynamics of the international market at the moment, they're very unfavourable to a continuation of the growth that we've seen in perhaps the last 15 years or so in the Australian casinos. If anything, I would see that growth being crimped substantially. It's been crimped by developments in China with regard to capital outflows and the control of organised criminal elements that were involved in junkets, the virtual demise of junket play, the growth of jurisdictions like the Philippines, Singapore, the potential for Thailand to come on stream, a lot of that is going to intercept the real big dollar end of the market before it ever looks to Australia. So I think governments are going to have to, as Peter said, look to sweeten the pot a little bit. And they're going to have to do it via what I would call a state agreement. So the state agreement entrenches the provisions that are offered to any inbound investor in the casino industry to ensure that not only is it sweet on day one, but on day 15,001, it remains equally as sweet. And we don't have the possibility of governments deciding for political reasons to change things that these properties are going to be sensitive to.
Could I just add into that? Sorry, Ben,
Peter.
could I just add into that? The experience that Blackstone has seen in Victoria, where the Victorian government chose legislation to abolish a contract, I think is going to make any new buyer wary of entering into agreements with state governments because they can't be trusted.
Yeah, that's a good point, Peter.
Sorry, David, I just wanted to add that point in.
It's a good point, Peter. A good point.
Star has already sold off a couple of non-core assets. The event centre in Sydney, the old Treasury Casino building up in Queensland. Last week, Star revealed they had been approached by their Brisbane partners, Chow, Fook and Far East Consortium, about potentially those two companies buying out Star's 50% stake in the Brisbane venture. David, I know that you and I spoke about this very recently, a couple of days ago, but do you see any roadblocks in that sort of situation becoming a reality?
Well, yes, I do, Ben. I think there are still questions about the suitability of Chow, Fook and Far East, which really arise and go back to the findings of the Bergen inquiry in Sydney. And in particular, the relationship between junkets operated by Sun City and the casino operators. We've had over the years, and people tend to forget this, as far back as 2012, there were question marks around some of the junkets that were working with Star in Sydney. And through these particular entities in Queensland at the moment, they were, well, certainly the group was involved in the Hoi Ana casino development in Vietnam, and the partner, of course, in that was Sun City initially. And I think there's a certain degree of uncertainty about whether if they were to be subjected again to what I might term more thoroughgoing suitability investigation, the government in Queensland would come to the same conclusion, and that is that there was insufficient evidence to find them unsuitable. I mean, this does raise an issue in my mind about where the onus actually lies. Does it lie on the applicants, in this case perhaps those two companies, to establish suitability, or does it lie with the government to establish lack of suitability? And I think we've often taken the view that governments presume suitability until they find otherwise. But in this case, we've already had the Bergen inquiry come forward with findings that suggest that there are adequate reasons why anyone that dealt with Sun City would be aware that there were potential links to 14K trade, for example. And to dismiss that out of hand, as appears to have occurred, or at least to minimise it, seems to me to raise further issues. Now, I have no particular insights, and I certainly don't offer any view as to whether government should or should not find either of those entities suitable. All that I'm saying is that a thoroughgoing process, such as the New South Wales regulator applied to Genting when it wished to increase its stake in Star, may well produce a less unequivocal outcome.
Yeah, David, you're right. It was an interesting terminology when the Queensland government said there was insufficient evidence to find Chow Tai Fook unsuitable to be involved in Brisbane. I mean, Peter, what do you make of that sort of wording, insufficient evidence?
I think there's a difference between someone already having found suitable and then determining whether to find them unsuitable. That's quite different from someone who's not yet an owner of something and whether they're suitable or not. So the test is a bit different from a regulator because you've got to be, put another way, it's easier to stop someone from becoming a licensee than it is to take a license away from them. So they've already been approved. And therefore, I think the onus is on the regulator to find something more, to find them unsuitable if they've already been approved, than if they were starting from scratch to be approved. And I think that's what's in that wording is I don't think there was enough for the regulator to be satisfied that they could take an approval away from them. It might have been enough to stop them from being approved in the first place, but that horse had already bolted. That's the way I interpreted it anyway.
Yeah, and of course, the other situation is if Star declares bankruptcy, as we said, they're Brisbane partners. It's not the situation for them. So what happens there when you've got basically the two partners that combine for 50% of the business are fine, the other partner is not fine? How does that particular situation resolve itself?
You go, David. I have no idea how that would work.
My reading of the Casino Control Act is that it would enable the government to step in and find someone to replace the 50% holder, the Star. But of course, it couldn't do that unilaterally without the consent or agreement of the other 50% shareholder in the casino licensee. That to me raises, all sorts of issues because how do you negotiate that? I mean, from the point of view of the other 50% controlled by Chow Tai Fook and the other company, they would hopefully want to retain Star as a manager because that's where the know-how is, that's where I guess the relationship with the regulator is likely to be. It's not going to be through them. So they would probably want to retain them on board. But whether that would be possible under that scenario, I really don't know. It may be that you would have a mortgagee, for example, saying, well, look, we're a secured lender. There's been a default, there's been a breach of our loan covenants, and we want to step in and broker that sort of settlement ourselves. Now, I just don't know enough about the dynamic of that vis-a-vis the government to know how that would resolve. But it would be a pretty unsatisfactory situation were it to arise.
Would add. Thanks, David. You helped me out there. I think it's worth adding, though, that the Casino Control Act's really only managed or provide a legislative framework for the casino part of the integrated resort. So there's a whole lot of other part of that business which is not covered by the Casino Control Act of New South Wales or the Casino Control Act of Queensland, but there are agreements in place. And so those agreements will come into play. And those will be tripartite agreements between the government, more than tripartite, but it'll be the Destination Brisbane Consortium, which is itself three parties, and the government and the regulator will all have to come to agreement about both the casino operation side, but also the non-casino operations. And the same thing would happen in Sydney as well. It's one thing for the casino license to be handed off to a manager, but someone still has to run the hotels and all the other ancillary businesses which are not actually regulated by the Casino Control Act directly. And so it's a much more complicated thing than just wondering about how a casino license what might happen to that casino license for both New South Wales and Queensland properties because of the way they're structured. People sometimes forget that when you talk about casino in the legislative sense, it means the gaming area and a few ancillary things like count rooms and surveillance and so on. It doesn't mean restaurants that are off the gaming floor or hotels or bars or anything else that's outside the approved gaming floor of the casino. So we have to be careful when we're talking to be clear what we're talking about. And that's one of the complicating factors about what somebody might be buying.
Yeah, that's also a very good point, Peter. Look, one of the other scenarios that's been suggested, it's actually a rumor that I've heard for some time now, is that particularly Blackstone, but possibly somebody else, rather than the Crown situation where they came in and essentially saved the company, bought out the company, they may actually be waiting for Star to collapse and then jump in after the fact then. What would be the benefit, the rationale for using that method?
Well, the price would be cheaper. One imagines. I mean, you'd be talking fire sale literally at that point, and the opportunity to cherry pick from whatever assets were still available for an inbound buyer. The problem with that, though, is that a lot of those assets are likely to be attached by specific charges, whether they're mortgages or fixed charges or whatever it may be. And you could potentially have any number of receivers, administrators, or even liquidators involved in trying to offload those as distinct elements, because the function of the liquidator or receiver is, of course, in the receiver's case, to recoup the amount owing to whoever's appointed them. In the liquidator's case, to try and maximise the return for unsecured creditors. So, there are competing objectives here. And I wouldn't guarantee any prospective buyer that they would do better by waiting for the whole thing to fall in a massive heap than if they were to take the initiative now and negotiate on the basis that they pay a price that would clearly be a price for a distressed asset, but still a unitary asset, one that comprises all its separate pieces. Otherwise, I can't really see anybody trying to stitch together a deal that would encompass so many different parts of the business.
David, this is an arcane legal point, but wouldn't the disciplinary actions expire because they'd be against the old company and not against the new company? So if you buy it now, any potential disciplinary action you'd still be on the hook for, but wouldn't the disciplinary actions against the old Star, if you like, disappear if Star actually goes into
Yes, you're
bankruptcy?
right, but I'm not necessarily talking about buying the entity. I was talking about potentially buying the entire business. So you could leave the entity behind and simply buy the business,
Yeah. And
take
then
over.
but then you get around the problem of the potential fines. That those fines will no longer be applicable to the new purchaser because they're not owning the company that actually caused problems to be. So that is one advantage of waiting, particularly when you don't know what the fine size might be. And I don't know if that also applies to Austrac as well with the money laundering fine that we're all expecting to be imposed on Star.
Yeah, well, I think what's clear at the moment is that there's going to be a tremendous shortfall. And if we wait long enough, people will be scrambling around. The secured lenders are going to struggle to get their money back, never mind the unsecured. And of course, the employees who are going to have some priority. But it's just going to be an unholy mess. And it seems to me that rather than chance your arm on that, if you were interested in trying to buy the thing as a going concern, you would move now to try and acquire the assets rather than simply wait for it to collapse under its own weight.
Peter, it's interesting that I mentioned that potential scenario of Blackstone waiting until after Star collapsed to go in for the kill. When it was mentioned to me by someone who should know some months ago, that whole scenario of avoiding paying those fines was cited as a key reason for that. So that's quite an interesting point that you raised there, that could be a very strong benefit for doing so.
And whoever might be interested has seen what Blackstone went through with Crown and Melbourne and saw that those fines were substantial and more than anticipated.
Certainly. Look, I might just finish, guys, with a last question for each of you. I'll start with you, David. Just to get your thoughts on, I mean, do you think Star can survive this? How do you see this playing out? And I guess either way, what are your thoughts on what this means for the future of the Australian casino industry? Are the glory days gone forever? Can there be sunnier days ahead? What are your thoughts generally?
Well, I think you might believe in fairies if you think that they can suddenly find an injection of capital that is going to save the day for them. I don't think that's going to happen. I think the people that are already invested in the Star are likely to be effectively quarantined in that position while the company works through either a sale, a collapse, or a very remote possibility of a workout. I think a workout would require some enormous accommodation by its current lenders and shareholders. And there's no guarantee that a workout's going to deliver the results that perhaps they anticipate might come. So from that point of view, I'm not really sure that the entity can be salvaged. That said, though, is a casino license still worth something? Well, yes, clearly it is. I think if the entity's rejigged, if you get proper governance, if you develop an appropriately lean and mean structure, and you get a good relationship happening with the regulator, then there is an opportunity to reinstate the business, perhaps not to what it was, but back to something that is certainly viable. But the glory days, as they were, with the high roller market, the relative freedom with which they were able to operate their junket businesses, pretty much a distant memory at this point. And the fact that it's now rippled out to Asia. We don't see too many junkets functioning even in Macau these days. They're pretty much gone. So I think from that point of view, we're not going to see the volumes that were perhaps typical. And without volume, you just don't get the returns. So people have got to realign their thinking, I think, to the point where you say, well, they can be viable businesses, but perhaps not on the scale that they have been in the past, certainly not in the Australian market. It's probably the time to be running something smaller than bigger.
Peter, what are your thoughts?
I was just thinking, as David was discussing, I think the other thing we keep in mind is that governments tend not to reduce regulatory requirements. They tend to continue to add them. But in this instance, I think that might be beneficial to Star, because I think what will happen is that some of the measures that have made playing at Star more complex in New South Wales, I think will eventually transition out to clubs and pubs. I just think that's just the way of the world, particularly with anti-money laundering obligations and identification requirements. So I think they might find that the Sydney property gets back to sort of an equal marketplace with its competition in the clubs and pubs. And I think that will help whoever is running Star in the future. I also strongly believe that the New South Wales government will not want it to close. So whatever's necessary, is probably not quite the right language, but I think the New South Wales government will eventually intervene if there's any sense that Star, the property, is going to close. There are just too many jobs at risk here for the New South Wales government to let fail. I'm not sure they want to help Star survive. In fact, I'm confident they don't necessarily want Star to survive at all, but they do want, I think, they don't want Star, the company, to survive, but I think they do want Star, the property, to continue. So I'm not expecting they'll necessarily provide them with a lot of help to find their own way, but I think they will do some things to give Star the best chance, Star property, the best chance to continue.
Well, yeah, certainly plenty to play out, plenty of questions to be answered over the coming months and years, I would say. So thanks, gents, for your insights. Very, very interesting today. And I look forward to seeing you again soon.